The Skins of the Fathers by Clive Barker. Read by Greg Blackman. The car coughed and choked and died. Davidson was suddenly aware of the wind on the desert road as it keened at the windows of his Mustang. He tried to revive the engine, but it refused life. Exasperated, Davidson let his sweating hands drop off the wheel and surveyed the territory. In every direction, hot air, hot rock, hot sand. This was Arizona. He opened the door and stepped out onto the baking dust highway. In front and behind, it stretched unswervingly out to the pale horizon. If he narrowed his eyes, he could just make out the mountains, but as soon as he attempted to fix his focus, they were eaten up by the heat haze. Already the sun was corroding the top of his head, where his blonde hair was thinning. He threw up the hood of his car and peered hopelessly into the engine, regretting his lack of mechanical know-how. Jesus, he thought, why don't they make the damn things foolproof? Then he heard the music. It was so far off, it sounded like a whistling in his ears at first, but it became louder. It was music of a sort. How did it sound? Like the wind through telephone lines, a sourceless, rhythmless, heartless air wave, plucking at the hairs on the back of his neck and telling them to stand. He tried to ignore it, but it wouldn't go away. He looked up out of the shade of the bonnet to find the players, but the road was empty in both directions. Only as he scanned the desert to the southeast did a line of tiny figures become visible to him, walking or skipping or dancing at the furthest edge of his sight, liquid in the heat of the earth. The procession, if that was its nature, was long, making its way across the desert parallel to the highway. Their paths would not cross. Davidson glanced down once more into the cooling entrails of his vehicle, and then up again at the distant line of dancers. He needed help, no doubt of it. He started off across the desert towards them. Once off the highway, the dust, not impacted by the passage of cars, was loose. It flung itself up at his face with every step. Progress was slow. He broke into a trot, but they were receding from him. He began to run. Over the thunder of his blood, he could hear the music more loudly now. There was no melody apparent, but a constant rising and falling of many instruments, howls and hummings, whistlings, drummings and roarings. The head of the procession had now disappeared, received into distance, but the celebrants, if that they were, still paraded past. He changed direction a little to head them off, glancing over his shoulder briefly to check his way back. With a stomach-churning sense of loneliness, he saw his vehicle, as small as a beetle, on the road behind him, sitting weighed down by a boiling sky. He ran on, a quarter of an hour perhaps, and he began to see the procession more clearly, though its leaders were well out of sight. It was, he began to believe, a carnival of some sort, extraordinary as that seemed out here in the middle of God's nowhere. The last dancers in the parade were definitely costumed, however. They wore headdresses and masks that tottered well above human height. There was a flutter of brightly coloured feathers and streamers coiling in the air behind them. Whatever the reason for the celebration, they reeled like drunkards, loping one moment, leaping the next, squirming, some of them, on the ground, bellies to the hot sand. Davidson's lungs were torn with exhaustion, and it was clear he was losing the pursuit. Having gained on the procession, it was now moving off faster than he had strength or willpower to follow. He stopped, bracing his arms on his knees to support his aching torso, and looked under his sweat-sodden brow at his disappearing salvation. Then, summoning up all the energy he could muster, he yelled, "Stop!" At first there was no response. Then, through the slits of his eyes, he thought he saw one or two of the revellers halt. He straightened up. Yes, one or two were looking at him. He felt, rather than saw, their eyes upon him. He began to walk towards them. Some of the instruments had died away, as though word of his presence was spreading among them. They'd definitely seen him, no doubt of that. He walked on, faster now, and out of the haze the details of the procession began to come clear. His pace slowed a little. His heart, already pounding with exertion, thudded in his chest. "My Jesus," he said, and for the first time in his 36 godless years, the words were a true prayer. He stood off half a mile from them, but there was no mistaking what he saw. His aching eyes knew papier-mâché from flesh, illusion from misshapen reality. The creatures at the end of the procession, the least of the least, the hangers-on, were monsters whose appearance beggared the nightmares of insanity. One was perhaps 18 or 20 feet tall. Its skin, that hung in folds on its muscle, was a sheath of spikes, its head a cone of exposed teeth set in scarlet gums. Another was three-winged, its triple-ended tail thrashing the dust with reptilian enthusiasm. A third and a fourth were married together in a union of monstrosities, the result of which was more disgusting than the sum of its parts. Through its length and breadth, the symbiotic horror was locked in seeping marriage, its limbs thrust in and through wounds in its partner's flesh. Though the tongues of its heads were wound together, it managed a cacophonous howl. Davidson took a step back and glanced round at the car and the highway. As he did so, one of the things, black and red, began to scream like a whistle. Even at a half-mile's distance, the noise cut into Davidson's head. He looked back at the procession. The whistling monster had left its place in the parade, and its clawed feet were pounding the desert as it began to race towards him. Uncontrollable panic swept through Davidson, and he felt his trousers fill as his bowels failed him. The thing was rushing towards him with the speed of a cheetah, growing with every second, so he could see more detail of its alien anatomy with every step. The thumbless hands with their toothed palms, the head that bore only a tricoloured eye, the sinew of its shoulder and chest, even its genitals, erect with anger or, God help me, lust, two-pronged and beating against its abdomen. Davidson shrieked a shriek that was almost the equal of the monster's noise, and fled back the way he had come. The car was a mile, 2 miles away, and he knew it offered no protection were he to reach it before the monster overcame him. In that moment, he realized how close death was, how close it had always been, and he longed for a moment's comprehension of this idiot horror. It was already close behind him as his shit-slimed legs buckled, and he fell and crawled and dragged himself towards the car. As he heard the thud of its feet at his back, he instinctively huddled into a ball of whimpering flesh and awaited the coup de grace. He waited 2 heartbeats, 3, 4. Still it didn't come. The whistling voice had grown to an unbearable pitch and was now fading a little. The gnashing palms did not connect with his body. Cautiously expecting his head to be snapped from his neck at any moment, he peered through his fingers. The creature had overtaken him. Perhaps contemptuous of his frailty, it had run on past him towards the highway. Davidson smelt his excrement and his fear. He felt curiously ignored. Behind him the parade had moved on. Only 1 or 2 inquisitive monsters still looked over their shoulders in his direction as they receded into the dust. The whistling now changed pitch. Davidson cautiously raised his head from ground level. The noise was all but outside his hearing range, just a shrill whine at the back of his aching head. He stood up. The creature had leapt onto the top of his car. Its head was thrown back in a kind of ecstasy, its erection plainer than ever, the eye in its huge head glinting. With a final swoop to its voice which took the whistle out of human hearing, it bent upon the car, smashing the windshield and curling its mouthed hands upon the roof. It then proceeded to tear the steel back like so much paper, its body twitching with glee, its head jerking about. Once the roof was torn up, it leapt onto the highway and threw the metal into the air. It turned in the sky and smashed down on the desert floor. Davidson briefly wondered what he could possibly put on the insurance form. Now the creature was tearing the vehicle apart. The doors were scattered, the engine was ripped out, the wheels slashed and wrenched off the axles. To Davidson's nostrils there drifted the unmistakable stench of gasoline. No sooner had he registered the smell than a shard of metal glanced against another, and the creature and the car were sheathed in a billowing column of fire, blackening into smoke as it bawled over the highway. The thing did not call out, or if it did, its agonies were beyond hearing. It staggered out of the inferno with its flesh on fire, every inch of its body alight. Its arms flailed wildly in a veiled attempt to douse the fire, and it began to run off towards the highway, fleeing from the source of its agony towards the mountains. Flames sprouted off its back, and the air was tinged with the smell of its cooking flesh. It didn't fall, however, though the fire must have been devouring it. The run went on until the heat dissolved the highway into the blue distance, and it was gone. Davidson sank down onto his knees. The shit on his legs was almost dry in the heat. The car continued to burn. The music had gone entirely, as had the procession. It was the sun that drove him from the sand back towards his gutted car. He was blank-eyed when the next vehicle along the highway stopped to pick him up. Sheriff Josh Packard stared in disbelief at the claw prints on the ground at his feet. They were etched in slowly solidifying fat, the liquid flesh of the monster that had run through the main street, the only street, of Welcome minutes ago. It had then collapsed, breathing its last breath, and died in a writhing ball 3 trucks' length from the bank. The normal business of Welcome, the trading, the debating, the how-do-you-dos, had halted. 1 or 2 nauseous individuals had been received into the lobby of the hotel while the smell of fricasseed flesh thickened the good desert air of the town. The stench was something between overcooked fish and an exhumation, and it offended Packard. This was his town, overlooked by him, protected by him. The intrusion of this fireball was not looked upon lightly. Packard took out his gun and began to walk towards the corpse. The flames were all but out now, having eaten the best of their meal. Even so destroyed by fire, it was a sizable bulk. What might once have been its limbs were gathered around what might have been its head. The rest was beyond recognition. All in all, Packard was glad of that small mercy. But even in the charnel house confusion of rendered flesh and blackened bone, he could make out enough inhuman forms to quicken his pulse. This was a monster, no doubt of it. A creature from Earth, out of Earth, indeed, up from the underworld, and on its way to the Great Bowl for a night of celebration. Once every generation or so, his father had told him, the desert spat out its demons and let them loose a while. Being a child who thought for himself, Packard had never believed the shit his father talked. But was this not such a demon? Whatever mischance had brought this burning monstrosity into his town to die, there was pleasure for Packard in the proof of their vulnerability. His father had never mentioned that possibility. Half smiling at the thought of mastering such foulness, Packard stepped up to the smoking corpse and kicked it. The crowd, still lingering in the safety of the doorways, cooed with admiration at his bravery. The half-smile spread across his face. That kick alone would be worth a night of drinks, perhaps even a woman. The thing was belly up. With the dispassionate gaze of a professional demon kicker, Packard scrutinized the tangle of limbs across the head. It was quite dead, that was obvious. He sheathed his gun and bent towards the corpse. "Get a camera out here, Jedediah," he said, impressing even himself. His deputy ran off towards the office. "What we need," he said, "is a picture of this here beauty." Packard went down on his haunches and reached across to the blackened limbs of the thing. His gloves would be ruined, but it was worth the inconvenience for the good this gesture would be doing his public image. He could almost feel the admiring looks as he touched the flesh and began to shake a limb loose from the head of the impostor. The fire had welded the parts together, and he had had to wrench the limb free, but it came with a jellied sound, revealing the heat-withered eye on the face beneath. He dropped the limb back where it had come, with a look of disgust. A beat. Then the demon's arm was snaking up, suddenly, too suddenly for Packard to move, and in a moment sublime with terror, the sheriff saw the mouth open in the palm of its forefoot, and close again around his own hand. Whimpering, he lost balance and sat in the fat, pulling away from the mouth as his glove was chewed through and the teeth connected with his hand, clipping off his fingers as the rasping maw drew digits, blood and stumps further into its gut. Packard's bottom slid in the mess under him, and he squirmed, howling now, to loose himself. It still had life in it, this thing from the underworld. Packard bellowed for mercy as he staggered to his feet, dragging the sordid bulk of the thing up off the ground as he did so. A shot sounded close to Packard's ear. Fluid, blood, and pus spattered him as the limb was blown to smithereens at the shoulder, and the mouth loosed its grip on Packard. The wasted mass of devouring muscle fell to the ground, and Packard's hand, or what was left of it, was in the open air again. There were no fingers remaining on his right hand, and barely half a thumb. The shattered bone of his digits jutted awkwardly from a partially chewed palm. Eleanor Cooker dropped the barrel of the shotgun she had just fired and grunted with satisfaction. "Your hand's gone," she said, with brutal simplicity. Monsters, Packard remembered his father telling him, never die. He'd remembered that too late, and now he'd sacrificed his hand, his drinking, sexing hand. A wave of nostalgia for lost years with those fingers washed over him, while dots burst into darkness before his eyes. The last thing he saw as a dead faint carried him to the ground was his dutiful deputy raising a camera to record the whole scene. The shack at the back of the house was Lucy's refuge, and always had been. When Eugene came back drunk from welcome, or a sudden fury took him because the stew was cold, Lucy retired into the shack where she could weep in peace. There was no pity to be had in Lucy's life, none from Eugene certainly, and precious little time to pity herself. Today, the old source of irritation had got Eugene into a rage. The child. The nurtured and carefully cultivated child of their love, named after the brother of Moses, Aaron, which meant exalted one. A sweet boy, the prettiest boy in the whole territory, 5 years old and already as charming and polite as any East Coast mama could wish to raise. Aaron, Lucy's pride and joy, a child fit to blow bubbles in a picture book, fit to dance, fit to charm the devil himself. That was Eugene's objection. "That fucking child's no more a boy than you are," he said to Lucy. "He's not even a half boy. He's only fit for putting in fancy shoes and selling perfume. Or a preacher. He's fit for a preacher." He pointed a nail-bitten, crook-thumbed hand at the boy. "You're ashamed to your father." Aaron met his father's stare. "You hear me, boy?" Eugene looked away. The boy's big eyes made him sick to his stomach, more like a dog's eyes than anything human. "I want him out of this house." "What's he done?" "He doesn't need to do a thing. It's sufficient he's the way he is. They laugh at me, you know that. They laugh at me because of him." "Nobody laughs at you, Eugene." "Oh, yes." "Not for the boy's sake." "Huh?" "If they laugh, they don't laugh at the boy. They laugh at you." "Shut your mouth." "They know what you are, Eugene. They see you clear as I see you." "I tell you, woman." "Sick as a dog in the street, talking about what you've seen and what you're scared of." He struck her, as he had many times before. The blow drew blood, as similar blows had for 5 years, but though she reeled, her first thoughts were for the boy. "Aaron," she said through the tears the pain had brought, "come with me." "You let the bastard alone." Eugene was trembling. "Aaron." The child stood between father and mother, not knowing which to obey. The look of confusion on his face brought Lucy's tears more copiously. "Mama," said the child very quietly. There was a grave look in his eyes that went beyond confusion. Before Lucy could find a way to cool the situation, Eugene had a hold of the boy by his hair and was dragging him closer. "You listen to your father, boy." "Yes." "Yes, sir. We say to our father, don't we? We say, yes, sir." Aaron's face was thrust into the stinking crotch of his father's jeans. "Yes, sir." "He stays with me, woman. You're not taking him out onto that fucking shack one more time. He stays with his father." The skirmish was lost, and Lucy knew it. If she pressed the point any further, she'd only put the child at further risk. "If you harm him..." "I'm his father, woman." Eugene grinned. "What do you think I'd hurt my own flesh and blood?" The boy was locked to his father's hips in a position that was scarcely short of obscene. But Lucy knew her husband, and he was close to an outburst that would be uncontrollable. She no longer cared for herself. She'd had her joys. But the boy was so vulnerable. "Get out of our sight, woman, why don't you? The boy and I want to be alone. Don't we?" Eugene dragged Aaron's face from his crotch and sneered down at his pale face. "Don't we?" "Yes, Papa." "Yes, Papa. Oh, yes, indeed, Papa." Lucy left the house and retired into the cool darkness of the shack, where she prayed for Aaron, named after the brother of Moses, Aaron, whose name meant Exalted One. She wondered how long he could survive the brutalities the future would provide. The boy was stripped now. He stood white in front of his father. He wasn't afraid. The whipping that would be meted out to him would pain him, but this was not true fear. "You're a sickly lad," said Eugene, running a huge hand over his son's abdomen. "Weak and sickly like a runty hog. If I was a farmer, and you were a hog, boy, you know what I'd do?" Again, he took the boy by the hair, the other hand between the legs. "You know what I'd do, boy?" "No, Papa, what would you do?" The scored hand slid up over Aaron's body while his father made a slitting sound. "Why, I'd cut you up and feed you to the rest of the litter. Nothing a hog likes better to eat than hog meat. How'd you like that?" "No, Papa." "You wouldn't like that?"
"No, thank you, Papa."
Eugene's face hardened. "Well, I'd like to see that, Aaron. I'd like to see what you'd do if I was to open you up and have a look inside you." There was a new violence in his father's games which Aaron couldn't understand. New threats, new intimacy. Uncomfortable as he was, the boy knew the real fear was felt not by him but by his father. Fear was Eugene's birthright, just as it was Aaron's to watch and wait and suffer until the moment came. He knew, without understanding how or why, that he would be an instrument in the destruction of his father, maybe more than an instrument. Anger erupted in Eugene. He stared at the boy, his brown fists clenched so tight that the knuckles burned white. The boy was his ruin somehow. He'd killed the good life they'd lived before he was born, as surely as if he'd shot his parents dead. Scarcely thinking of what he's doing, Eugene's hands closed around the back of the boy's frail neck. Aaron made no sound. "I could kill you, boy."
"Yes, sir."
"What do you say to that?"
"Nothing, sir."
"You should say thank you, sir."
"Why?"
"Why, boy? Because this life's not worth what a hog can shit, and I'd be doing you a loving service, as a father should a son."
"Yes, sir."
In the shack behind the house, Lucy had stopped crying. There was no purpose in it, and besides, something in the sky she could see through the holes in the roof had brought memories to her that wiped the tears away. A certain sky, pure blue, sheeny clear. Eugene wouldn't harm the boy. He wouldn't dare, ever dare, harm that child. He knew what the boy was, though he'd never admit to it. She remembered the day, 6 years ago now, when the sky had been sheened like today, and the air had been livid with the heat. Eugene and she had been just about as hot as the air. They hadn't taken their eyes off each other all day. He was stronger then, in his prime, a soaring, splendid man, his body made heavy with work, and his legs so hard they felt like rock when she ran her hands over them. She had been quite a looker herself, the best damn backside and welcome, firm and downy, a divide so soft-haired Eugene couldn't keep from kissing her, even there, in the secret place. He'd pleasure her all day and night sometimes, in the house they were building, or out on the sand in the late afternoon. The desert made a fine bed, and they could lie uninterrupted beneath the wide sky. That day, 6 years ago, the sky had darkened too soon, long before night was due. It had seemed to blacken in a moment, and the lovers were suddenly cold in their hurried nakedness. She had seen, over his shoulder, the shapes the sky had taken, the vast and monumental creatures that were watching them. He, in his passion, still worked at her, thrust to his root and out, the length again, as he knew she delighted in, till a hand, the colour of beets and the size of a man, pinched his neck and plucked him out of his wife's lap. She watched him lifted into the sky like a squirming jackrabbit spitting from two mouths, north and south as he finished his thrusts into the air. Then his eyes opened for a moment, and he saw his wife 20 feet below him, still bare, still spread butterfly wide, with monsters on every side. Casually, without malice, they threw him away out of their ring of admiration, and out of her sight. She remembered so well the hour that followed, the embraces of the monsters. Not foul in any way, not gross or harmful, never less than loving. Even the machineries of reproduction that they pierced her with one after the other were not painful, though some were as large as Eugene's fisted arm and as hard as bone. How many of those strangers took her that afternoon? 3, 4, 5? Mingling their semen in her body, fondly teasing her joy from her with their patient thrusts. When they went away and her skin was touched with sunlight again, she felt, though on reflection it seemed shameful, a loss, as though the zenith of her life was past and the rest of her days would be a cold ride down to death. She had got up at last and walked over to where Eugene was lying unconscious on the sand. One of his legs was broken by the fall. She had kissed him and then squatted to pass water. She hoped, and hope it was, that there would be fruit from the seed of that day's love, and it would be a keepsake for her joy. In the house, Eugene struck the boy. Aaron's nose bled, but he made no sound. "Speak, boy.
What shall I say?"
Am I your father or not?"
"Yes, father."
"Liar!" He struck again without warning. This time the blow carried Aaron to the floor. As his small, uncalloused palms flattened against the kitchen tiles to raise himself, he felt something through the floor. There was a music in the ground. "Liar!" his father was saying still. There would be more blows to come, the boy thought, more pain, more blood, but it was bearable, and the music was a promise, after a long wait, of an end to blows once and for all.